Hello. Feel free to get ready.
Hey, Matt.
Hello, you guys are all on mute. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. That's you, Morgan?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so
Great.
much. I appreciate you taking the initiative and showing off this great article.
Yeah, no problem. It just kind of came across it when I was searching up virtual reality, and I know a little bit about radio oncology.
Cool. Yeah, I had a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, no problem. I figured that I'd add some context to it to help everyone out.
Cool.
How are your guys' long weekends?
I actually went to the MIT virtual reality hackathon.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so it was my second year in a row, and it's just intense. It's so intense.
What was the theme?
It's just anything XR. So you can build in productivity, social good, fun. Yeah, so I built for healthcare, and it was pretty cool.
Awesome.
1 second, sorry. Yeah, so we built a Alzheimer's aid tool using the Magic Leap. So where family members could post reminders for people in space and time to perform a task. And then we also actually got real-time facial recognition using OpenCV on the locally on the Magic Leap, which their employees said wasn't possible. So yeah, so that's kind of cool. They were like very much excited when we pushed our GitHub, and so yeah, they said that the fact that we got it done was going to reprioritize their feature deployment. So we made sure to publish it on their platform, so that there's a timestamp that we did it before the company did. So it was really cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So what's focusing on right now? Because I was at their LeapCon last year. There's like a lot of games, and I went to all the health stuff, but I hadn't heard anything since about any big progress or milestones they've hit.
For Magic Leap?
Yeah.
I mean, they're like super secretive, right? I don't really know nobody knows really what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I mean,
I tried out like the HoloLens 2 from Microsoft, and I think it was way better than Magic Leap's.
Oh, there's this new one. Yeah, I didn't get to try I was like so busy, and this time around I didn't get to try nearly any of the new headsets. But or see really anyone's demos. But there was one called the N-Reel, It's an AR like glasses, and it's amazing. It's really, really nice. They deployed at CES this year, and
Okay.
they had like retina display in the glasses and the lenses, and also the field of view was huge. So it's like really, really promising.
No, I'm just looking at, I hadn't heard of these. They look like standard sunglasses, which is huge.
Yeah, I mean they look kind of corny. They're kind of big and chunky, but
Uh-huh.
like that's a limitation and constraint of the design as it is. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I was very much impressed. I was very, very much impressed.
Very cool.
Yeah. So
All
maybe
right.
we'll wait 2 more minutes before for other
Okay.
people to come in. Yeah, I'm gonna put myself on mute for just 1 second. Okie doke. Thank you. Okay. Well, I guess we should just get started. Morgan, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. I picked this article because it's sort of what relates to some of the research I'm doing about how virtual reality can be applied to patient education and what value that serves for both the patients and the physicians together. Um, so, this article focused on repurposing a tool commonly used to train radiation oncologists and also somewhat of the medical physicists associated with radiotherapy. So if you're not familiar with radiotherapy, this is a form of treatment for cancers. So they use something called a linear accelerator, sometimes called a LINAC. And that's a system where you go in and it sends a beam down and that hits the cancer and you go in for a few treatments. It's sort of like an alternative to chemo, or sometimes paired after undergoing chemotherapy. So that's a little bit about radiotherapy, where they go in almost sort of like half a CT. They go lay on this bed. Um, so this tool was called the VERT, and this study was conducted by a group down in Australia, and they wanted to see if repurposing this training tool and applying it to patient education would have any value for the patients on their knowledge about their treatments, their anxiety levels, and also just their impression of the treatment and satisfaction overall. And I thought it was a really interesting article, especially comparing the patient's knowledge and also the potential for better satisfaction. So I guess off the bat, did anyone have any questions, like just at the top of their heads?
I guess my primary question was just like, what were the types of educational tools, or how do they prepare patients to begin with?
Right. So typically, patient education, you meet with a radiation oncologist, and they often provide print materials. And recently, there's been a big emphasis going over like online videos because you have the ability to replay them over and over again. And what that has, they found in other studies that having that ability to replay and also share the videos has been huge because you think about these patients are extremely stressed. They've just been hit with this diagnosis of cancer. And of course, their family is going to have questions. And so, one way that they can answer some of those family questions is you show them the video. And so, everyone can be on the same page and can help the patient through their training, their treatment. And so I think it said it in the when I was going over the control group and the methods. The control group was giving the standard patient education, so they met with the radiation oncologist, and they're probably given print materials. And I'd also assume most hospitals also provide videos as well, going over what to expect and how the treatment works. One more thing I wanted to touch on, just to get the terminology, the simulation it talks about. Simulation in radiotherapy has a specific meaning. So this is the stage of where you go in, you've already met with the physician, and you're actually going into a CT, a real CT, and they localize where they're going to place the radiation later, and they mark out specific areas. Sometimes they like put a little tattoo on the patient, and they do that so they get the exact same orientation every single time they go in for their radiotherapy treatment. So in the stage of the simulation, that's what it's referring to, where they're going into a CT, and the physicians and the technicians are making sure they have the exact position correct every time with
Hmm.
that.
So it's kind of
Um,
this screenshots of the application that we see here.
let's see. So that is a view of the training
Hmm.
device.
Yeah, the vert.
Right. So before, this is a commonly used tool to actually train radio oncologists,
Hmm.
and um, they say it's virtual reality. I was exploring around on the web, and it seems like it definitely is used to visualize everything. I don't know if it's a standard VR, with like an Oculus thing, or if they're just wearing like glasses, sort of like a cave immersive. But
Hmm.
this is the view they see, and you can see there in the cross section with the CT positioned, and it's showing, okay, these are the major organs, how are they influenced by the beam. um, but that's actually a visualization of the linac itself over on the far right. So they
Hmm.
just sit on that table, and the arm will rotate and then provide the beam.
I am in a meeting. I'll talk to you next time. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. So I guess I can just get to summarizing, sort of taking it through it. So the introduction, it talked about, why patient education might be important. There's been a lot of findings recently that having better patient education programs leads to better compliance. And
Hmm.
what was interesting, I thought in the article, was that there was a high dropout rate in both the control group and the VERT group, they call it. And a lot of times, these patients, they diagnosed with cancer, and they, it's just a really big mental burden to overcome. And they don't always continue on with treatments, and compliance, especially with, treatments such as chemotherapy, very unpleasant. And they're finding that better patient education programs related specifically to oncology helps improve compliance and hopefully lead to better outcomes. So I thought that was something to bring up. Um, they go over what the VERT system is, about the realistic movements and sounds of a linear accelerator. Um, and this study was specifically for breast cancer patients, which is very common, and goes over what they were planning to do. And they're just saying that this study hasn't really been done by anyone else analyzing the education methods of a VERT. That's been studied for teaching, but not for this application of actually patient education. So that was kind of a quick summary of the introduction. And I'll go into the methods. So there was two groups. There was a control group, and then there was the VERT group, or VG. And so what happened, they split up these patients, and I think at the end of the day was 18 and 19, so pretty much split, that actually stuck with the program. And the study was designed so there'd be 4 main points where they'd be given these surveys. And these surveys were used to rate some of their just basic demographics, their predisposition anxiety, their anxiety levels, their knowledge about their program, their trust in the physician, and sort of overall satisfaction at these different points. And they wanted to see if there was any significant differences in having this form of patient education as opposed to the standard practices that the hospital had been using. So all patients with breast cancer, they knew English, and so at the very beginning, both groups were given the same, at T1, they were given the first survey, which was about demographics, and the anxiety survey, they're actually given 2. So there's 2 used. There's the state trait anxiety inventory state, and the one that was state trait anxiety inventory trait. So at T1, this was the only time that the trait one was applied to understand how susceptible they were to anxiety. But the state one, the one that with the STAIS, was given all 4 times, and that was to honestly look at how their anxiety levels fluctuated, or if there's any trends throughout the treatment. So that was anxiety. About their experience, standard Likert 5-point scale, about their confidence with their radiation treatment, and just seeing again over time if there was any changes and any differences between the 2. So I'm on page, I guess this is 4 now, and like Max brought up, here's kind of a visualization of what this VERT system looks like. So again, I thought it was interesting that all the patients, when they were given this presentation of room, they were given the exact same, basically patient. And I thought it would have been interesting to have their personalized scans in there, because the VERT system does allow any DICOM images to be in there. For example, that first picture on the left, any images can be applied to that. And I would have been interested to see possibly another group, if their personalized images were used in the training, to see if that would have any effect on their program or not. But that was something I was interested in. They went into the data analysis, and I'll go down to the table. So I'm looking at Table 1 is pretty much just the demographics, and there was nothing significant in demographics. It was really just used to show that the 2 groups were consistent. But in Table 2, this was interesting, comparing the VERT group and the control group. So this was Table 2 refers to the knowledge scores, and there was actually a significant difference with the VERT group retaining information as opposed to the control group. One thing that was interesting, they didn't actually test the people on their knowledge. It was just a personal survey. And so you don't know if people were just, overconfident maybe with the VERT training as opposed to the standard practice, but they mentioned that that was possibly unethical, giving a test. But you do see that initially at T1, the VERT group actually had lower scores slightly. You can see about the knowledge about simulation, the CG is higher, about planning, CG's higher, and basically overall there was a difference. So they start off actually about the same, but slightly below the CG group. And then looking just at even T2, there's already then a shift where the vert group is more familiar and feels that they have retained more knowledge than the control group. And that was a big finding of this study about is medical knowledge with this patient education better perceived by these groups using virtual reality. So that was the one major finding of this, that the virtual reality group felt they knew their knowledge better than the control group. And then table 3, this relates to the anxiety. So as I said before, if you see T1, they tested both the STAIT and then the STAIS. The vert group again apparently was more susceptible to anxiety than the control group slightly, but they were both of them, there was no significant difference in the anxiety itself, but the vert group did have a large decrease if you compare T1 to T4 by the end of their treatment. So there was a larger difference from start point to end in the control group, but there was no significant difference between groups. And that makes sense too, because your anxiety is always going to be highest at the very beginning before the treatment begins. And that's why there's been a lot of efforts to push patient education early and earlier to try and mitigate some of that anxiety, which can pose a barrier to good outcomes. And then this was just, the next graph is just going over some of the anxieties, just showing that both are decreasing. There's a slight jump in the control group at T3, but it's just showing that both are decreasing over time. And then in table 4, I thought it was interesting to read the actual questions. And one that stuck out with me was, I'm able to explain my radiation therapy treatment to my family and friends with confidence. Because a lot of times these patients, they go in for their meeting with their physicians, and they know that their physicians have told them all this information, and but they still have this overwhelming anxiety. And then when they go back, they're too embarrassed to ask the same questions again. And that's been studied as well as a big fear and problem. That's also just, it's a positive feedback loop of just increasing the anxiety associated with these radiation oncology patients. And that just causes more problems communicating with the family and friends, which also increases their anxiety. So that was interesting, just going over some of the questions themselves. Looking at the scores about the experience, I believe it was a significant difference between the vert group and the control group about their satisfaction with the treatment. You can see most of them were perfect scores on the Likert. For the vert group versus the control group was slightly lower. And this has some relevance because there's been some efforts in the reimbursement community to actually base physician reimbursement with satisfaction. There's been some talk about applying that as a factor. And so this is definitely gaining more traction about how do you evaluate patient satisfaction, and how big of a factor should that be. So that was just another side note to add in about this. Limitations. Talked about some of the statistical stuff about patients dropping out. Again, it is cancer, and so some people are going to get sick, and there was some variability about the stages.
Well, they also said, I think like longitudinal studies, there's always dropout. So I wouldn't be surprised with this. But they also said that the VR education services were done at like a separate site, so that it required a little more activity out of each individual. So
Hmm.
I would be interested to see how, um, if this were applied at the point of care, at the site of care, to be a little like less barriers of compliance, what would the outcomes be?
Yeah, I was surprised by that too because this is a training device, and a lot of hospitals have it actually. I know the hospital I was with, they use it to train a lot of the residents, and yeah, that would be interesting to lower that barrier, and hopefully that they would get more participation. Um, and they just kind of talked about how it was all survey based as well, so there's no standardized way to control for that. Um, but overall, I thought it was a really interesting comparison of how different methods of patient education, what impacts they might have on information retention and improving communication between the physician and the patients and the patient's close network. And moving forward, what could we expect in the healthcare field with
Mhm.
these emerging technologies?
So the thing that they use to train the residents isn't the
Mhm.
same as it would use to train patients, though, correct?
No, so this is kind of a relatively new strategy. Most of the time, there's standard little like pamphlets that they give the patients to take home, and they sit down with their physician. And then they also, there's been some support again for these videos that you can play and
Right.
have on the internet. But the problem is a lot of patients go online looking. The first thing they do is Google what's out there, and some physicians have different opinions, but there's been some talk that it's sometimes what they find is inadequate, or it's just not right, and so they want to find a way to basically give all this information to the patient in a way that they can understand and share with their family. Because most of the time, the patients are not medically trained, and this is really complex information, right? Medical
Hmm.
literacy is a big problem right now in the US. And so, how do you find a way to communicate this complex information about, a very serious topic, someone with cancer, in a way that they can comprehend and share and make better decisions and outcomes related to their treatment? So
Hmm.
that's really what this is about, repurposing these tools and see if there's a more effective way to communicate that information. But yeah, it's slightly different when they go in and train, the radio oncologists and the techs. It's more about explaining, okay, here's where you position the beam. These are the organs that are at risk. How do you control the dosage? Because that's a big thing with these linear accelerators. It's all about controlling the area and determining how dosage is applied.
Hmm. Hmm.
So.
Cool. Um, yeah, I think is how important is patient compliance as far as like the outcomes of the procedure? I'm just trying to think of like where, if you were to apply like some sort of training tool. I mean, education obviously and satisfaction is like paramount, but is there like specific aspects that you need the person to abide by that that this type of technology could be used to reinforce?
Right. So like compliance, a lot of times I've seen more studies with the compliance side related to chemo and taking your medications. They're often unpleasant, and you don't feel you don't want to eat, and so you got to stick to your regimen. And I've seen other applications, almost like games, where you try and win points and by following your regimen by your doctor. So a lot of
Hmm.
the compliance is about medications and
Right.
keeping up with those. So I don't know if these video simulations, I think it can talk about, okay, you're going to have better outcomes if you do this, and don't rub off your tattoo. Um, but this was more about just understanding like information retention and communication.
Yeah, yeah, which is super important.
Mhm.
Cool.
Does anyone else have questions or comments or reactions?
I think I think that was really drastic. These knowledge scores changing
Mhm.
from time one to time two, and it's really I know there's like OSO VR that has made these claims about how good people are at performing surgical procedures because they're performing it rather than just watching it or reading it. And I think this is kind of a good example of those types of that idea that XR
Mhm.
has this great ability of having someone like live through it, which is really important.
Mhm.
And also, I also think this is just really well done in that they addressed all their limitations pretty thoroughly. So they knew about what they could and couldn't do. And you mentioned the test and how that might be a kind of an unethical thing to do. So they didn't want to go into some realms that may cause patient stress or anything.
Right, especially
But
with a sensitive patient group. It's one thing if, these people have breast cancer in later stages, if
yeah,
they're getting an accelerator. So, no, I was impressed by this study.
yeah, it's really well done. I'm wondering if these authors have done anything else in this area, like regarding like virtual reality or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't familiar with them. I hadn't recognized any of their names.
So this is in supportive care in cancer. That's interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see which one of these authors made that virtual reality experience and or um, how what they think the future is being used.
Mhm.
It wasn't too long ago, so 2017. So that's pretty cool.
Right.
Cool. Thanks, Morgan.
Oh, no problem. Glad I could share with everyone.
So can you remind me again what kind of research you do?
Right, so I've been working with a team of neuroradiologists down at MD Anderson, and they use this tool called Anatomy, and it's basically a visualization software in VR where the radiologists and the surgeons can view a 3D rendering of a patient's neuroimaging and interact and interrogate the images in VR. So they aren't limited to just looking at standard like planes of view, sagittal,
Hmm.
coronal, axial,
Right.
but they can actually go in and sort of simulate how the surgery will go out. For example, there's a way to sort of remove all the skin, and then you go through the skull, and then you see all the blood vessel landmarks, and sort of pre-surgical planning for neurosurgeries, and especially so MD Anderson is exclusively a cancer center, and
Mm.
so they are sent some of the most extreme and later stages of brain cancers in the neuroimaging department.
Hmm.
And so they've been using the VR software for the last few years. I've worked with them for the past 3 summers. And this year, they're really moving forward on incorporating into an augmented reality interface so
Mm.
that surgeons in the OR can interact with that data, a foot above the patient, sort of glance and reference it, and make sure uh, the surgery goes as planned, and to get sort of double check where they are and the approach they should be taking. So that development process is actually going on right now down there about converting the VR interface into AR and
Cool.
kind of gathering information and figuring out what types of gestures the surgeons want and how it will be applied and visualized in their environment.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, that was another thing. I was wondering how applicable some of these the educational tools or how variable each individual's like treatment is,
Mhm.
because how I imagine it would be hard to visualize, an individual's scans in order to see what was actually going to be applied to that person rather than like a
Right.
general experience.
Because there's been this big trend in personalized medicine, right? Usually
Yeah,
related to genetic personalization. But what impact does it have for the physician to say, these are your scans, here's how I'm going to approach it, here's where the beam's going to hit you. I feel like that psychologically probably has a large impact
yeah,
on patient, and it just helps with that communication and engagement with the
oh, for sure.
physician.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, I mean, if you're doing an AR real time, like walk through a new visualization tool, you have to have the individual scans.
Right.
But so I'm wondering what kind of like pipeline or what tool they're using to do that.
Right. So right now with neurosurgeries, at least down there, they've had a different approach with some of these other segmentation softwares.
Hmm.
You're familiar with neuromaging, so like with the DTI,
Hmm.
and going through, labeling different tracks that, might be relevant to the surgery.
Hmm.
But it takes so long for a trained tech basically to go through and do it. The quick ones do it in around 45 minutes. So they either have to do it the day before, or much earlier before surgery.
Right.
But that's a huge time cost for the physicians. And so one factor is time. And so if you're able to get these scans in within 5 minutes and have everything segmented with the proper tracks and areas of interest, that's a
Mm.
huge, huge factor. So that's where AI is, trying to come in, and it's really interesting and fascinating to see how all these sectors are intersecting in healthcare.
That's really cool. Do
Mhm.
you see any other spaces that this kind of training, or do you other see? Yeah, where do you see the future of it going?
I think it's applicable. I mean, right now, neurosurgery, it's very interesting with the FDA about some of the leeway they give in some of these more investigational areas. I think it's going to come down to a lot to the regulatory side and how much leeway they'll give.
Hmm.
Um, Neurosurgery, it's pretty extreme, and so they're more open to
Hmm.
these investigational techniques. I could see it. I mean, there's a group at MD Anderson looking at it was a pancreatic surgeon group, and they were using it to plan their surgery. So a lot of the abdominal um, anatomy is very complex, and especially on the images. Um, so that was another area. All the internal medicine surgeons.
Awesome.
Hmm.
Cool. Well, thanks very much, Morgan. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
And we will be doing another one in 2 weeks. Unless anyone else had any comments or anything that they wanted to add. Is there something in chat?
Oh, oh, thanks, Christina.
Yeah, so we'll do another one the first week, Wednesday in February, and I believe it's Christina's turn. But I'll follow up with everyone on that. But yeah, if anyone didn't have any other questions, we can wrap it up. So anything you wanted to add, Morgan?
Nope. I think I got it all.
Okay, cool. Well, again, thanks very much, and look forward to sharing a new article.
All right. See you guys in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.